Welcome to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm Joshua Feinberg, your host from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to our weekly live show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem and critical facilities and digital infrastructure, regardless of whether your company is a data center operator like a hyperscaler or colocation or edge or modular or wholesale data center provider, or perhaps you do something related to data center technology or data center facilities, or maybe it's something to do with construction or real estate or investment, or perhaps your company works in and around the vibrant outsourced sales and marketing ecosystem that powers data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. And it doesn't matter where you are on the go-to-market team. Perhaps you work in some facet of sales or account management or marketing or product or channel partnerships, or perhaps you are the executive sponsor, the leader, the one who is responsible for going out to the marketplace and recruiting the best and the brightest, onboarding, making sure that everyone is collaborating and perfectly in alignment, rowing the boat at the right speed, playing their musical instruments at the right tempo, playing from the right sheet music, and making sure that your company, your team, is in a perfect position to capitalize on this amazing period of growth. If this is the first time you're joining us for Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us. Let us know in the comments what you do in the data center industry. We'd love to know. And if you've been with us before, if you're perhaps a frequent flyer, welcome back. We're glad to have you with us as well. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So what is on the agenda for today? What are the topics that we'll be addressing? We're going to first start in the technology part of the data center ecosystem and look at how a data center technology provider produces a use case document of an enterprise deployment. After that, we'll hang around for a little bit while longer in the technology part of the data center industry among those 22 different business models that we catalog over at DCSMI, and we'll talk about how a data center network management and infrastructure firm convinces clients of data center services value. After that, we'll head on over a little more towards the facility side of the data center ecosystem and look at how a data center operations service provider improves its lead generation. After that, we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a telecommunications infrastructure and connectivity provider addresses sales and marketing overload. Next, we'll look at how an advanced data center analytics and monitoring company can improve its lead generation and sales. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how wholesale data center providers can reach high-level decision makers. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you, your team, your company are facing in improving your lead generation, reaching the right decision makers, improving your brand awareness among data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure, and you think that this is a topic or a question that we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on, and we'll add that to the consideration queue to address in an upcoming episode. So let's dive into this week's first question, which is, again, in the technology part of the data center ecosystem. So first up, how does a data center technology provider produce a use case document of an enterprise deployment? So your company is a technology provider, and you've just done what you feel is a case study worthy enterprise deployment. You've implemented a project for a large company, for an enterprise, which by definition usually is a minimum of several thousand or tens of thousands of employees. Probably not all working at the data center, but you have something that you're proud of, and you want to make sure to let the world know about that. So how do we produce a use case document around that? For starters, one thing that I should point out is when you're able to publish a use case, when you're able to publish a case study, consider yourself very fortunate, because a significant part of the data center ecosystem is shrouded in this culture of extreme secrecy, where you're just not allowed to talk about anything outside of your company. So the fact that you have a client that is so thrilled with the work that you've done with them and for them, and that they're willing to let you talk about it, is fantastic. So what can we do to help you capitalize on that? Well, there's the traditional formula that people have used for decades with a case study. Is like, okay, well, this is the problem that this company had. This is the solution that we put in place. The more specifics, the better. And these are the benefits that the clients achieved as a result of us implementing, as a result of us taking care of this enterprise deployment. Now, let's talk about the typical accounts. Let's talk about the typical personas that would be involved in creating a use case like this. So for starters, for a technology provider that specializes in the data center industry, you probably have two broad categories of clients. You have data center operator clients, and you have enterprises that have their own data centers. So within the category of data center operators, you might have clients that are co-location operators, hyperscale operators, edge data center operators, for example. Or if you work with enterprises that have their own data centers, perhaps you're working with financial institutions, healthcare, government, manufacturing. A lot of companies decide to have their own data centers. Some decide to co-locate in other people's data centers. Some people decide to put it all in the public cloud. Some people decide to have private cloud, multi-cloud. A lot of different ways to go with this, but typically the most common path that would take a technology provider to having a case study is probably because they're either working with an operator or an enterprise that has their own data centers. So those are the two broad categories. Then within the account level, when you get into the buyer personas, depending on the company size, depending on how many locations they have, generally smaller companies with fewer data centers tend to have more people wearing lots of different hats. So you have a lot of generalists as opposed to specialists, whereas typically when you get into enterprise deployments and really large companies where there's hundreds, if not thousands of people working in the IT organization, it might be very common to find dozens or hundreds of people working on that company's data centers, in which case, even on the technology side, you may have a lot of different contact people. So who's the ideal person to have featured in that case study? Well, for starters, usually case studies are focusing more on the success with the account as opposed to the individual. The individual, where that would come into play in this choosing the buyer persona that you feature as like the hero in the case study, that would usually come into play if there's some photos, if there's some video, if there's some quotes. And generally, most people would tend to pick the highest level person in the organization that was involved in this initiative, that was involved in benefiting from this enterprise deployments. So for example, if your company has the primary relationship is like with an assistant vice president or a vice president, but that person is one or two layers removed from the CTO, and you've gotten to meet the CTO a few times, and they know about the great work you've done, even if they weren't that hands-on involved in the project. If you can get the CTO to be the one that's quoted and the one that's interviewed, it's typically a bigger feather in your cap. But that also brings up another really important consideration when I mentioned photos and videos and printed case studies. If you have the ability to record the case study as an interview, ideally in person, you may only need as little as 10 or 20 minutes, especially if the person is extremely busy. The rest, maybe you can get some B-roll footage where you can have your videographer selectively go around the data center with your contact person. And if you're allowed to take video of certain places, that would probably be super cool. But I would recommend, if you have the ability to record the case study in video in person, would be ideal. The second best would be recording it remotely. using Zoom or a similar kind of tool. It's always a lot easier to go from video to print than it is to go from the other way around. So in other words, once you have that interview, it's fairly straightforward to take the recording of that, transcribe it, and turn it into a document that can be a nicely formatted PDF and make that a nicely formatted blog post. And you could embed the video within the blog post or the website page. Some people gate, some people put a landing page form in front of case studies. I don't see that happening quite as much anymore for good reason, because there's been a lot of pushback against gating content in general. And I think over time, you'll continue to see that practice more and more fade into the sunset. So if you're on the fence with that, just understand the general consensus is moving away from gating case studies. While it is nice to know if you have a known contact that's in your CRM and your marketing sales automation platform, it is nice to know that there's a micro conversion, a reconversion against a case study that's gated there. The reality is most of your buyers at that point, assuming as long as you've intercepted them in the awareness stage, your software is probably going to pick up on the fact that they looked at that page anyway. So for example, if you're using HubSpot and they've converted earlier on an ebook download or attended a webinar or something like that, and you set up a active list of monitoring people that hit the case studies page, there can be all kinds of workflow automation on that at the minimum that are sending internal notifications to your sales team to potentially follow up on that. So there's a lot different ways to approach this, but when it comes to a data center technology provider that produces a use case document of an enterprise deployment, the general workflow that I would use is I'd try to get the highest level person in that organization who's reasonably familiar with the benefits of that enterprise deployment. I would, if you had your ruthers, I would prefer to go on site with probably a 2-camera shoot if you can do it, and interview that person for 15 or 20 minutes in person. You want to ask sparingly, because this is something that they're really doing you a favor to participate in. There's not a huge amount of tangible benefit to them. It's not like you're interviewing them on a podcast or putting them in a webinar where they're putting themselves out there as a thought leader, where you're putting them out there as a thought leader and helping their build their professional brand and their company brand. Now, in this particular case, they're actually endorsing, and which is the challenge of getting a lot of people to agree to be in your case study. So when you do, use that permission, use that participation sparingly and very graciously. So 10, 15, 20-minute interview. You probably pare it down to a shorter version of that. Maybe there's 5 to 10 minutes that you use, or 3 to 5 minutes that's usable. Maybe you have a shorter version and a longer version that you use in different contexts, depending on whether it's on the website or on LinkedIn or on YouTube. But for sure, you should be able to go fairly easily from the video to transcript to turning that into a printed text case study, nicely formatting as a PDF. In the course of visiting that client and doing the video shoot, hopefully you got some good B-roll and you got some good video and some good photos that you can include with the PDF of that. And more than likely, you're probably also going to put a version on your blog or on your website, normal SEO kind of optimizations. So it's discovered not so much in Google, because we know that Google SEO is going away very rapidly, but so it has the potential to get discovered in all the chat and the generative AI tools that most of your highly technical buyers are using on a very regular basis as their substitute for what used to be conversations with humans. So your case study, when somebody is looking you up, looking them up, looking up that category, has an opportunity to potentially show up in ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini and Perplexity and Claude and whatever new generative AI tools pop up in the future that have a similar trust-based discovery mechanism. And granted, the cool part with doing this in the time and place that we're in right now is all of the generative AI engines, even the 2 big search engines at this point, know that case studies are an extreme trust signal. And because of that, it kind of helps lift everything up along with it. But those are some of the things I'd be thinking about for how a data center technology provider produces a use case document and enterprise deployment. Don't start with the document again, start with a video shoot. If you can do it in person, great. If not, remotely. But because you'll get a lot of more people that the video case study resonates with more than even the PDF, more than the document. But you really can have your cake and eat it if you start in that order. If you start with a video and go to document, go to web page from there. Potentially, you could even do audio if you want. So, for example, if it was conducive to share this within a podcast episode that you were doing, if you were sharing clips of that, usually most podcasts focus more on thought leadership and tips and best practices. But maybe there is for instance, where you're talking about, let's say this was a disaster recovery initiative, or this was a load balancing initiative, or this was something having to do with storage arrays or something like that. And you wanted to bring in a 2, 3, 4 minute segment of that case study. Yeah, there is a use case for potentially this showing up within a bigger asset like a webinar, an on-demand webinar, a podcast asset, in which case it could be potentially repurposed into an audio version as well if you're running a podcast. So yes, multimedia version. Some people too will take a short clip of that and also run it as ads. For example, on LinkedIn Campaign Manager, let's say your finished video is 8 minutes. You might do like a highlight reel or a sizzle reel or something like that to 60 or 90 seconds and run that, post it organically on your LinkedIn profile and on one or more of your LinkedIn company pages or showcase pages. But you may also decide that this is such a fantastic case study that you take the video version of it, or potentially even a LinkedIn document version of it, like a PDF version of it, and you decide that you want to run this to your target account list. So let's say there's 400 companies on your target account list and you want to reach everyone that works in an IT job in those 400 accounts. Very, very doable with LinkedIn Campaign Manager. You need strong enough unit economics to afford to play on that platform. But yeah, for sure, it's a great opportunity to spread the reach of your case study as a great middle funnel kind of mid-buyer's journey tool to be able to educate, build trust, and accelerate more of your leads into sales opportunities. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how a data center technology provider can produce a use case document of an enterprise deployment. If you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, be sure to hit the like button to help spread the word. Okay, what do we have up next? What's our next question? How does a data center network management and infrastructure firm convince clients of data center services value? Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So your company provides network management and infrastructure on an outsourced basis as a professional services firm, and you're having trouble convincing clients of your services value. That's a great question. So usually what this means when I hear this in the world that we live in today is it usually means that you may not have arrived early enough in the buyer's journey to build up enough relationship equity, to do enough education and trust building to stay with them throughout the full journey. So what do I mean by that? Well, 10 years ago, if someone who's leading a network management and infrastructure firm in the data center segment reached out to me about this, you could count on the fact that at the time your buyers, typically IT professionals, channel partners, and some other folks in similar kinds of roles, you could count on the fact that they would do a significant amount of research on search engines, on social media. They'd be asking questions all day long on Google and LinkedIn and Siri and Alexa and watching YouTube videos and going to review websites. But at a certain point, they get about halfway through that journey. At the time, the prevailing research showed that about 57% of the journey was over before sales contact, before vendor contact. And that wasn't too bad. So like if you did everything right, you could count on the fact that you were in there on their side of the table, educating and building trust for the final 43% of the journey. But 10 years of digital transformation has now happened. We have all of these baby boomers retiring, a lot more Gen Z and millennials in decision-making roles, 10 years of digital transformation, tens of millions of people getting used to working from home, working remotely, especially in the beginning of the 2020s. And that 57% number has jumped all the way to 83%. In other words, Gartner found that 83% of a typical B2B buyer's journey now happens without you in the room. All the researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens without someone speaking with someone from your sales team. And wow, is that a big change and a big challenge for a lot of companies that are still using a very traditional sales and marketing playbook. So even if you do everything right, you're only in there for the final 17%. And the way the person worded this question, where they're trying to convince potential clients that their company deserves to exist, that there's actually some value in that they provide, it sounds like they're in that state where they're treading water. Because they just simply didn't get in early enough to be able to have the right stakeholders have an open mind to you, leading them through understanding how others in similar companies have worked through these kinds of challenges. This is where it's super important as well to be very deliberate about the kinds of clients that you're working with. Like, for example, does your ideal client profile, your ICP, is it crystal clear about geographically where these clients are located? Now, network management infrastructure, a lot of that on the technology side can be delivered remotely, but you're almost certainly going on site from time to time. So from a geographic coverage perspective, do you have the ability to market and sell and service globally? Or do you really need to dial things in to just be one particular continent, one particular region of the world? Maybe it's one country, maybe it's just one metro area where clients are located within 30 to 60 minute drive of your main location if you just have a single location. So figuring out the geographic part of your ideal client profile is a really big deal. Company size for a professional services firm like yours is also something that you really want to think through. Why is that? Well, when it comes to outsourcing network management for a data center, when it comes to outsourcing help with infrastructure for a data center, there's really two extremes, and then there's kind of the middle sweet spot of the bell curve to consider. What do I mean by the two extremes? Well, when we think about the company size of a prospect of yours or a future client of yours, and we measure that in terms of number of employees, you could measure it in terms of revenue turnover as well. But when it comes to most of the prospecting tools, especially the super popular ones like LinkedIn Sales Navigator, they all tend to run on employee headcount. So let's say, for example, you know what your minimum level of engagement is. You know what your entry level program looks like for someone that wants to engage your company for outsourced network management and infrastructure work. With that in mind, how big does a client need to be to afford your minimums? Can you really sell your network management program, your outsourced infrastructure management program, to a single location co-location operator that has 8 full-time employees? Do they really have the resources to afford what you're doing? They may have a huge need for what you're doing, but you know what your minimum is, you know what their revenue is, you know what their budget roughly is. So is that realistic? Or do you say that, okay, the floor really should be, we want clients that have at least 50 employees. At 50 employees for co-location, you're probably getting to a business that has at least a couple locations. At 200 employees, they may have a handful or two of locations. And enterprises, it'll just be similar math, but just usually considerably larger. So we need to know, how big do they need to be to afford your minimum program? And at the other extreme, at what size does an enterprise have internal capabilities that can run circles around your company's current capabilities, where it just wouldn't make sense for them to outsource to you given your company's current size? Or they would impose so many financial restrictions on you, so many legal restrictions on you, integration requirements, multi-location requirements, that it's just not realistic for your company to have the resources to engage at that level. So again, this is about being self-aware. So sure, everyone loves to have enterprise clients and enterprise revenue because it can move the needle. But aside from the revenue concentration issues of having all your eggs in one basket, at what point does it become really, really challenging for your existing team to be able to handle a client that's just huge? Are you out of your comfort zone beyond 10,000 employees, or you're out of your comfort zone beyond 5,000 employees, or you're out of your comfort zone beyond 1,000 employees. Let's say, for argument's sake, it's 1,000 employees, which would be like a large mid-market, maybe a really small enterprise. Probably at 1,000 employees, you'd probably consider it large mid, the sweet spot or mid-range of like mid-market. So let's say, for argument's sake, that that to really afford your entry-level program, they need to be at least 50 employees, probably at least like 10 million in revenue or your local currency equivalent. And so anywhere between 50 employees and 1,000 employees. You may say that's pretty restrictive, but it actually isn't. Depending on where you're located, there are likely anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred in each geographic region that potentially fall within that range. So again, we're talking about ideal client profile. We're talking about optimizing for where you have geographic presence and how big or small your ideal client should be. And then also, are there certain industries that tend to be a better fit than others? When it comes to network management and infrastructure, because you're going near their data, a lot of times there's going to be situations where, depending on where you're located, where they're located, that there's certain industries that are a better fit than others, because those industries trigger the need for your company having certain accreditations, compliance, certifications. If you work within healthcare or government or education or manufacturing or financial services, or just in general run a co-location facility, there's certain kinds of credentialing, certain inspections, certain qualifications that you need to have to be able to play in that space, especially in certain geographic regions, especially for certain kinds of clients. If you have those, fantastic. They should be in your ideal client profile as specific kinds of industries that you go after. And you probably want to make sure that you have some content on your website that makes it super clear that you have that expertise and have those credentials. And the flip side of it is, if you don't have those credentials and you're going to get knocked out pretty early, don't spend a lot of time on ad campaigns and outbound and lead generation in places that you can't win. So I wouldn't put up a page on your site next to the who we do help with who we do not help. But for sure, if you're running outbound campaigns, don't waste time and resources on outbound campaigns on prospects that you are not going to be able to close, that you're not going to be able to win. Along the same lines, don't run money on ads targeting prospects that you can't win. Along the same lines, make sure the drop-down lists on your website form are tracking the goods and the bad fits. So if they hit a bad fit, you can segment them out and they don't get passed to sales and they just get nurtured. And you can do the same thing once you have that data, that structured data, and how you segment and filter your lists in your CRM system, and how leads get rotated and assigned to different members of your sales team. So those are some of the big considerations to set up the right foundational plan here to make sure that we're thinking about this the right way. Because to convince clients of your data center services value, we need to be very clear about what a client is and what a client is not. Because if you're really trying to nail relevancy and nail value, I'd encourage you to get very specific about who the right clients are for you, who the ideal clients are for you. And that exercise that we went through, which many times can be fueled by looking at the public facing part of your website, the logos that are on your website, your case studies, your testimonials, what do they have in common? That many times helps you back into your ICP, your ideal client profile. If you don't have that there, your CRM system, your financial system, talking to your executives within your company should help to drive a lot of clarity there. But at the end of the day, what we really want to do is arrive as early as possible in the journey, so our prospects, who are future clients, spend as much of the 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision with members of your client-facing team, learning about all the different directly and indirectly related issues that come up regarding network management and infrastructure. And you heard me right, 28 touch points. A lot of the reason that companies in this space go off the rails and don't get good enough leverage in the sales process is they are in on one or two touch points. Like, they meet someone at a conference and they follow up and they have a conversation. The reality, though, is people are so risk averse. They need so much more information. They're doing so much more on this on their own in a self-driven journey than they ever had before. And of course, when you're selling to IT professionals, as always, they're highly technical, highly skeptical, highly cynical. They're not big fans of hanging out with sales and marketing folks. So we really, in order to earn our way back in, they have to see you and your colleagues on your team as more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, perhaps even thought leaders. In other words, they have to really see you as a peer If they see you as a vendor who's just trying to get points on the deals board, who's just trying to get an opportunity so you can make quota, you're going to turn them off really, really quickly. So the way to approach this so that you can really frame the conversation and be with them in the formative stages where they establish and really confirm the criteria that they're going to use to make a decision on this big initiative is becoming a core part of their learning and development, a core part of their professional development, which from a practical standpoint usually means being in the events business. And by events business, I don't mean going and renting the biggest possible booth you can at all these global and national conferences. That can bankrupt certain kinds of companies if you're not careful. And in many cases, the loss factor is super high, where there's a huge percentage of people that are at that show that don't even line up with your ideal client profile. And even when they do, we still need to get you in a position where you're educating and building trust, not just begging for a couple of minutes of attention when they're walking by your booth at the expo on their way to get free drinks and appetizers. What we really need is we need 30, 45 minutes of undivided attention from them, not in a pitch, not in a commercial, infomercial kind of setting, but an education and trust building setting. People that speak at conferences, that are on the stage, that have earned it through editorial, not pay to play. The people that are there for editorial reasons are doing educating and trust building. But at a typical conference, that's only 5 or 10% of the people that are at the conference. Another 10% are buying booths, trying to interrupt people. The other 80% of the people aren't doing any education and trust building. In many cases, they're just hoping to profit from the exhaust, to profit from the byproducts of people being there, listening to the people that are on stage and going by the booth. So how can you stack the decks in your favor to have educational events that really start to move the needle for data center network management and infrastructure? If you're very dialed into your ideal client profile and you've built out a target account list, what I would encourage you to do is, once you understand who your primary and secondary buyer persona is, go do your homework and figure out what's going on in their world. What are their 5 or 6 biggest goals and their 5 or 6 biggest challenges that each of those segments are working on? So after you've done the research, either through interviews, surveys, studying their search and social footprint, end up with 10 or 12 topics. Ideally, half of them are goals that they're working on individually as a team and as a company, and another 5 or 6 of those are things that are driving them nuts: stressors, challenges, blockers. So you have 10 or 12 topics for each of your primary, your secondary, maybe there's even a tertiary persona. What I would encourage you to do with those 10 or 12 topics is those are your first 10 or 12 events to put on your events calendar to host yourself. If you're in a position where your prospects and clients, future clients, can easily drive to your facility, and you have a nice conference room or classroom where you can host small, informal professional development like workshops, breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, you don't need a large room, 10, 20, 30 people, because these are the perfect people. There's no loss factor here. You're only inviting people that are from companies on your target account list and in job roles within those companies. So yeah, you may not always get to the decision maker, but the goal with all of this is that over time, when you deliver really good value in these events, you're going to meet multiple people from this company. And sooner or later, as word starts to spread about how amazingly helpful these educational events are, you will start to meet multiple people that sit on that decision committee. And when they get lots of value, not only are they motivated to bring their buddies, to bring their coworkers, perhaps even bring their boss the next time around, but you start to really dramatically improve the surface area and those accounts, and you're in a fantastic position for your internal subject matter experts to dramatically impact the criteria that they use to evaluate for this initiative, for everything that's directly and indirectly related to data center network management and infrastructure. So when you repeat this on a monthly basis, over time, you'll hopefully see more and more people from these same accounts coming out. Pretty simple format. They sign in, they have a little bit of networking time, you have some lunch or breakfast, whatever time of day it is. You have a 30 or 45 minutes session that's providing so much value that you're so confident that if they saw this exact same session at a conference, you're highly confident you would have had one of the highest rated sessions at the entire conference, and you'd have great evaluations, the little report cards that people fill out for you after they attend the session. You're highly confident that everyone that was there at the beginning is totally dialed into and hanging on your every word throughout the entire thing. And then afterwards, you open it up for Q&A, And if they're, in the case of an operator, I always recommend taking people on tour around the facility on a data center network management infrastructure firm. I don't know, maybe you do have a data center facility to take them on a tour around that's directly attached to your business that shows your company really well. If not, do the next best thing is try to make it a more formal chance for them to experience a little bit more. But again, the cool part is with these small events, and you get to know everyone really, really well. And that's the goal of all of this, is building up the know, like, and trust, so you get the inside track about what is really going on. And when you do this well, there's no need to convince clients of your services value. The education that you're doing, becoming a core part of their professional development and learning and development, is doing all of the convincing for you, because they keep coming back and learning from your clients. They keep coming back from learning from your client-facing team members. And if you have account executives, account managers, sales development marketers, product managers, whatever it is, if you have internal subject matter experts that have enough expertise in those 10 or 12 topics, fantastic. Each one gets assigned to present at one of these every so often, so it's not a burden on any one person. If you've exhausted all of your internal subject matter experts and there's a couple topics that have come up where you don't have anyone internally, go to your channel partners, go to your vendors, go to your contractors, and bring in a guest speaker. You're not going to get extra credit just because they have a business card that perfectly matches up with your client. All the prospect, all the future client knows is they came to a fantastic event where they learned a ton, and their impression of your company is like off the charts now. And most of all, you've piqued their interest, piqued their attention about something they thought they really had a good handle on, but you're asking them the tough questions and getting to think 2, 3, 4 steps ahead of where they currently are by sharing how other companies similar to theirs have navigated this process of figuring out how to optimize their network management and how to optimize their network infrastructure. So that's the overall approach with this, is when it comes to convincing clients of your services value for outsourced professional services around data center network management and infrastructure, there shouldn't be a need to convince if you're educating and building trust all along by becoming a core part of multiple people from that company's learning and development, professional development process. So that's what I'd recommend thinking about for a data center network management and infrastructure firm that's struggling to convince clients of their data center services value. So what do we have up next? Okay, next question up is, how does a data center operations service provider improve lead generation? How does a company that provides outsourced operations service to data center related clients improve its lead generation? That is a terrific question. And when it comes to lead generation, a lot of people confuse two very different kinds of leads. From a salesperson's perspective, typically your account executives want to spend most of their time talking to people that are a perfect fit against your ideal client profile and showing extremely strong signs of interest. So much so, be careful what you wish for, that if they're a perfect fit and showing extreme signs of interest, if you're in a commoditized category, your leadership team may be thinking about, do we still need an account executive in this process? Or is what you're selling commoditized, low cost, low margin enough that we should be giving people the option to self-buy, like e-commerce kind of buying, self-sign up? And with large purchases, with considered purchases, 5-figure, 6-figure, 7-figure deals, it's very unlikely that that's going to happen at scale, where they obliterate all these sales jobs anytime soon. But in the low end of the market, we've already seen this happen, like with bare metal and entry-level co-location and product reselling, where you're selling things that are 3-figure, 4-figure purchases that have narrow margins, where it's just not cost effective to have human sales force involved in educating and building trust anymore. So essentially you're investing in making your website better, having great product marketing, great explainer videos, great interactive tools. And the idea is that if your brand is strong enough, your buyers or your channel partners should be able to self-sign up, self-purchase, and self-onboard. So with all of that in mind, so that's the lead that's essentially a sales opportunity. For most people, if you're like most that are watching this, for the foreseeable future, for the next 6, 12, 24, 36 months, when most people are thinking about sales, they're thinking about thinking about leads, they're essentially thinking about a sales opportunity. This is someone that is a great fit, that fits your ideal client profile, and they're showing strong signs of interest of engaging with someone from your sales team. This is sometimes often called a hand raiser, because they're essentially raising their hand and saying, I'm ready for help. I'm ready to talk to sales. I'm ready to book the demo. I'm ready to book the tour. So that's one way of thinking of leads, and that's the sales-centric approach to thinking of leads. Your marketers, on the other hand, may have a very different definition of a lead. And it really just depends on how aligned you are about the different stages that a lead potentially goes through with your company. So for example, if your company invests a lot in sponsoring events and exhibiting at big conferences, your marketing team may do a victory dance when it imports 300 badge scans from a conference and call them leads. Are they leads? Yeah. Are they ready to talk to sales? Some of them maybe, but all you really know is that they attended this conference and they visited your booth. In some cases, I've seen people that confuse the people that visited your booth with the overall attendee list. And as a benefit of sponsoring the event, they got access to everyone that registered for the event. So instead of the 300 people that visited your booth, you have access to the 3,000 people, the other 90% of the people that were at the event but didn't visit your booth. And in some cases, I've seen people import all 3,000 names into their CRM and calling them leads. Do most of those 3,000 people want to talk to your sales team? 90% of them had the opportunity to visit your booth and didn't. So tread accordingly and plan accordingly with how you go about trying to educate and build trust and nurture them to advance them into sales opportunities. So you kind of have these extremes. Along the same lines, there's people that scrape websites and call some of those leads. If you're good at inbound lead generation, like you have downloadable ebooks and reports and planning guides and interactive tools, sure, those are generating leads as well. And depending on how your systems are set up, there's probably a certain amount of qualification that can happen by simply matching up. Does the domain name on their email address, is that on your target account list? If you have other information like geographically where they're located and company size or their business model, that may also get them to be considered marketing qualified, triggering a human on your salesperson to look at that. But the key thing with all of this is to make sure that you and all your team members that you work with are on the same page about what is actually a lead. When do you call it a lead? When do you call it a sales opportunity? And just to make sure that you're on the same page with that. So for a data center operations service provider that wants to improve its lead generation, it's recognizing that late stage leads that you don't have a relationship with, that haven't been educated and nurtured by your company, you may think are really awesome, but the reality is, if they went through nearly all of their buyer's journey, if they got to the 83% point in their buyer's journey and you never met this contact before, if they've never attended an event of yours before, if they've never consumed any of your thought leadership content, rest assured, well, maybe not rest assured, but just to understand, they're learning somewhere. Most buyers in and around the data center ecosystem now very strongly prefer a self-driven buyer's journey, where they want to get almost all the way to the point of purchase before they're ready to talk with someone from your sales team. If you and your company are successful at intercepting them early and often, so you can have a significant presence in the awareness and the consideration stages of their journey, where over and over and over again, you keep providing more and more value that shows them how other people in similar companies and similar industries have navigated these challenges around outsourcing their data center operations, that's fantastic, because it helps to frame the context that you have some of the smartest people on the planet on your team when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center operations. In other words, you've gotten out of the vendor box, you've stayed out of the vendor box, and they for sure see that you have deep expertise within your company about data center operations. They see your client-facing team members more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, perhaps even thought leaders. And that's fantastic, because as you host your own events, you tend to see over time, multiple people from the same company attending together. So you're improving your surface area, you're increasing your surface area in those accounts. Over time, you'll get to meet multiple people from the decision committee, and you should be able to do a reasonably good job of impacting the criteria that they use to set up the purchase criteria that they use to evaluate all the different options that are in front of them. When that's done well, you'll start to have a really, really big impact on stacking the decks in your favor with getting very well educated, very high trust opportunities by the time you're handing these off to sales. The flip side is if you're not involved in any of that at all and you manage to meet someone who got educated and learned to trust another company, just understand you're treading water. And the only thing that's going to typically sway their decision is you undercutting on price. And the race to the bottom is not a place that most of us want to be in a world where commoditization, global competition, self-driven journeys, AI, all of this, it's so important for us to have a strong brand individually, as a team, and as a company. And a huge part of that is being the ones that are in there shaping the criteria that they use to evaluate your category. So again, that's the strong argument for where lead generation needs to be joined at the hip with thought leadership content and thought leadership events. Events are fantastic. I mean, when you can get one or more stakeholders from a target account to come spend 45 minutes, an hour, 90 minutes with you several times a year and start to get more and more people from that same company joining their coworkers, joining their colleagues, bringing their boss along, you will really stack the decks in your company's favor tremendously, so much to the point that, perfect example here, your conference room seats 20 people and 7 people of those 20 are all from the same company. And that didn't happen the first event. This is like the third or fourth event. The first event was just 1 or 2 people and it's built up to 7. It's super likely that one of those 7 people comes up to you before and says, yeah, we got a lot of people from our team. With that in mind, we have like an all hands next Friday for our whole IT team. Do you want to just come in and do a version of this or a customized version of this to meet the rest of our team? You're like, yeah, you want me to bring breakfast or bring pizza? We're happy to do that. So that's how you get your foot in the door in a very meaningful way, where you can shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options that are in front of them. And that's what lead generation looks like, to put your company in a position to really stack the decks in your favor, where you're educating and building trust on an ongoing basis, where you have presence in as many of those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision as possible. Again, it's all about the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, the right context. So they see you and your colleagues as some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to outsourcing data center operations. So that's how a data center operations service provider can improve its lead generation. So that puts us at just about the halfway point on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been getting good value so far from this week's program, be sure to hit the like button to let your colleagues know. We'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor, and we'll be back with 3 more of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you're watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center critical facilities and digital infrastructure ecosystem. So what's up next? Now we're going to dive back into the technology part of the data center ecosystem and look at technology, telecommunications, infrastructure, and connectivity. So viewer wants to know, how does a telecommunications, infrastructure, and connectivity provider address sales and marketing overload? How does a telecommunications, infrastructure, and connectivity provider address sales and marketing overload? So reading between the lines here, I'm thinking that this is an external problem, not an internal problem. In other words, it's relatively rare that a sales professional or a marketing professional would feel that they're too much and they need to dial back. It's usually they're getting feedback from their prospects and clients that they're tired of sales and marketing. They're overloaded with it. And because of that, they're having a really hard time breaking through, differentiating, cutting through the noise. That is a fantastic question. And it's one that we deal with very, very often over at DCSMI. So for a telecommunications infrastructure and connectivity provider that wants to cut through the noise and get past their prospects and clients' sense of sales and marketing overload, we need to figure out another way to show up because they don't want to spend time with sales and marketing folks. The way we're going to do that is we need to get dialed into exactly who they are and what they care about, what's going on in their world. And the way we're going to do that is we first need to understand what's going on at the company level. And then we need to drill into who the key people are on that account that we need to be building relationships with, that we need to educate and build trust with over time. So at the account level, when it comes to telecommunications infrastructure and connectivity, assuming it's the exact same kind of client that buys all three of these products, services from our company, to get dialed into our ideal client profile, usually if you don't have this documented already, you can find some pretty good clues about this on your website, sitting in your logos, your testimonials, your case studies, your reviews. If that's not available, you can certainly go into your CRM. You can talk to your chief commercial, your chief revenue officer, your head of sales, your head of marketing, your head of finance, and they for sure should be able to give you some direction on the kinds of clients that are really paying the bills, that are really driving the company's future, and that most, even more importantly, that are strategic enough that look like the kind of clients that you want a lot more of. That's going to help you get some clarity on that ideal client profile. So you know geographically where they tend to be located. When it comes to telecommunications and infrastructure and connectivity, usually it means that you have carrier relationships that make you a player, that make you a presence in a particular geographic market. And if you do, then that's part of your geographic scope. If you don't, then that's probably not part of your geographic scope until you build relationships in that particular region. So that's the geographic part of the ideal client profile. Then there's the size. Now, when it comes to telecommunications infrastructure and connectivity, some of it for sure can be self-sign-up, which means that in theory, if a sales professional does not need to be involved, you may not need a particularly high minimum. You may be able to have relatively low cost entry-level price points at which you can engage, in which point you don't need a particularly high ceiling on the minimum level that a company needs to be to fit within your ideal client profile. That said, from a practical standpoint, most of the account executives, most of the sales teams that I know that work in these three sectors are selling a much more complex product or service that has a price point that's more associated with a complex product or service. And as a result, there will for sure be some companies that are just too small. What's too small? Only you know your entry-level price point. But for example, if a 5-person tech startup comes along, do they really have the resources to afford your minimums? Or do they need to be at least 50 employees or at least 200 employees? And along the same lines, how's your success rate at being able to close huge enterprise clients? Are you just as successful selling to SMB and mid-market as you are to selling to Fortune 500 companies? Or do you notice a significant drop-off in your success rates once a company is bigger than, say, 10,000 employees or 5,000 employees? So take into account those two extremes and figure out what the bottom end of the range and the upper end of the range is for your ideal client profile. For the sake of argument, for keeping it simple here, let's say maybe for your telecommunications infrastructure and connectivity, that you're very comfortable and successful selling to companies that have anywhere from 50 employees up to 1,000 employees or something like that. And then there's certain industries that may be better fits than others. When it comes to telecommunications infrastructure and connectivity, the industry may not be as big of a deal, but maybe you notice patterns sitting in your case studies, sitting in your CRM, where you've been much more successful with certain industries than others. A lot of times with the way that go-to-market is moving within this space, a lot of times the reason you have industry success is because you've hired talent, because you've hired people onto your sales team that brought decades of industry experience and industry connections from their previous career into your company. So sometimes it's not as random as you think, and it has a lot to do with recruiting. For startups, it's super common that the founders' relationships and industry experience tends to give you that stronger industry concentration and beachhead early on. So you have your ideal client profile defined. Next, within that ideal client profile, you should be able to build out a target account list of the perfect companies that fit that ideal client profile that you'd love to have as clients. And then within those accounts, we need to know the individual people that we want you to build a relationship with. So in the case, depending on how big or small these companies are, bigger companies, you'll tend to have much more granular job titles and job functions, a lot more people involved. Smaller companies, you tend to have more generalists wearing lots of different hats. So you have fewer buyer personas. So more simple segmentation and personalization challenge when it comes to combating sales and marketing overload. So let's say we're talking about large, small businesses and mid-markets. So it'd be pretty common as you start to move into certain companies with a couple hundred employees that you start to see IT departments with 5, 10, 15 people in them. And within 5, 10, 15 person IT departments, it's relatively unlikely that you see someone with telecommunications in their job title or infrastructure. It can happen, or connectivity in their job title, probably infrastructure, maybe telecommunications. Again, smaller IT departments tend to have more generalists. So you have like a VP of IT or a CTO, you have like a network manager, you have a support manager, you have an operations manager, you have a cybersecurity expert, something like that. So the smaller the company is, the less critical it is that you get the perfect person out of the gate, because everyone knows everybody. In a larger enterprise where you're selling into a company where the IT department has hundreds of employees or thousands of employees, yeah, it matters a lot more that you get the job titles and the skills endorsements and the targeting and everything right to get closer to those multiple stakeholders that are ultimately going to need to weigh in on the decision committee. So again, the level of how specific you are in defining those personas, the level of how specific you are in setting up your targeting for ads and outbound will become very much a function of how big or small your prospects and clients' companies are. And along the same lines, usually in order for you to be successful selling to really large enterprises, your company is going to tend to be bigger. If your company is smaller, you probably have a lot more success selling to smaller businesses and mid-market businesses with fewer people in the company, fewer IT people, and less need for absolute perfection in getting the job titles and the job functions perfect. What we're looking for on a directional basis, though, is we need to know for the people in that IT department that are directly or indirectly involved with telecom infrastructure and connectivity, not only who they are, their job functions and what they have in common, but most of all, what's going on in their world. So let's say, for example, we think our primary in a small to mid-sized company is the VP of IT or the CTO. We need to know that person's 5 or 6 biggest goals that they're currently working on, that their team's working on, that their company's currently working on, that's directly related to telecommunications, connectivity, and infrastructure. And in addition to those 5 or 6 big goals, we need to know the 5 or 6 things that are driving them nuts. Like, we'll give you 10 or 12 topics for each of the most important buyer personas. What do you do with those 10 or 12 topics? That's our events calendar. Those are the 10 or 12 sessions that we're going to do if we're hosting in-person breakfast seminars or lunch and learns, or we're hosting a webinar series, or ideally both. We know it's, especially for free events, it's very rare that you'll ever get much more than a 50% attendance rate. Usually it's considerably lower. So there's always going to be people that wanted to be there that weren't there. So whether it's an in-person event or whether it's a webinar, always record and make it available on demand. Though there will almost always, when you do a good job too, there'll be people that attend from a company that's like, oh, Bob should have been here. Susan really should have been here. My boss really should have been here. Do you have a recording? Can I send them the slides? Like, yeah, here you go. And that's great for repurposing as well. Not only for you to continue promoting that for people to be able to watch it on demand, but to take the 45-minute recording and chop it up in 5 or 6 shorter videos, and potentially a dozen or more really short videos, like vertical videos for LinkedIn or YouTube Shorts or something like that, and repurposing it into blog posts, repurposing it into social media posts, email nurturing, email newsletters, all of the above, documents, infographics. The whole idea is part of the reason why they have sales and marketing overload is because they're not getting good value from your sales and marketing. So we need to throw out the traditional sales and marketing book here, and we need to recognize that we're now in a world where sales and marketing is being obsoleted by self-service. And in order to earn our way back in by self-service, we need to be seen as experts. We need to be seen as trusted advisors. In other words, your team members have to be able to provide more value to your prospects and clients than they can get on their own just by asking questions on LinkedIn and YouTube and ChatGPT and Copilot and Perplexity, Gemini, and Claude. If your AEs, if your account managers, if your SDRs can't provide more value than your prospects and clients can get from reading your website, watching your explainer videos, and asking self-service questions, you're pretty much sunk. So we need to be able to provide more value. This changes the nature of who you hire. This changes the nature of how your company invests in upskilling, reskilling in your own professional development. Because in order for us to have enough leverage in that buyer's journey, your prospects and clients essentially need to see members of your go-to-market team as their peers. If they see you as a vendor who's has sales breath, that's just coming across as desperate all the time, that's begging them for a meeting to come in and pitch, and they feel that all you're trying to do is get a deal on the deals board and closing a deal, nobody wants that anymore. They didn't want it 5 or 10 years ago. Now in the age of AI and self-driven journeys, they really, really don't want it. So in order for us to be able to earn our way in and get past that sales and marketing overload, we have to move beyond being seen as sales and marketing professionals and instead be seen a lot more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, and maybe even thought leaders. And the way we do that is by extreme relevance, extreme specificity for who they are, what's going on in their world, and how we can add value. Again, in much the same way that a lot of sales teams are reframing the job titles and the positioning of how their client-facing team members are seen, we're also seeing this extreme specialization now, where, for example, someone that worked in sales and telecommunications or fintech or something like that for 10 or 15 years comes along, and they may not know telecommunications or infrastructure or connectivity or some facet of what you're doing perfectly, but they have a ridiculous amount of institutional knowledge for that particular vertical. They know exactly the pain points on technology adoption. They know the companies, they know the individuals, they know the stakeholders. So what we're seeing increasingly is CROs, Chief Revenue Officers, Chief Commercial Officers, specializing their team members by vertical, by industry. So you have an individual or a team that just works with healthcare clients. You have an individual AE and an SDR or a team that just works with manufacturing clients or just works with data center operators or K-12 or higher education or something along those lines. And the whole idea is the people that you're hiring are so knowledgeable about this sector that they could be technology consultants for that sector. And because their knowledge of that space is so strong that they could almost have a nights and weekend side hustle doing that kind of work for small and medium-sized businesses, they're able to provide extreme value to your prospects and clients. So these are some of the ways to move beyond sales and marketing overload. Is if you think about the enterprise AE, the enterprise account executive of the future or the present, depending on how realistic you want to be about how much the world has already changed, not that it's going to change, but what's already happened, looks a lot more like a big four consultant, meaning that the way they engage with their prospects and clients feels a lot more like your prospects and clients are talking to $1,000 an hour consultant from PwC, KPMG, EY, Deloitte, something along those lines. And your account managers post-purchase look like the MBA, the Master's in Business Administration or PhD version of that individual. That's really the table stakes going forward. Again, this changes the nature of who you hire. It changes how aggressively your go-to-market team members invest in their own professional development to be able to add value at a much higher level. But addressing the sales and marketing overload is really about repositioning your sales and marketing team to be a lot more actively involved in your prospects and clients' learning and development, professional development process. And in order for you to be able to operate at that level, to put together these fantastic webinar series, breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, you need to really understand what's going on in their world and how you can add value. The cool part with all of this is if your company is used to spending obscene amounts of annual budget going to super expensive national and global conferences, webinars and breakfast seminars and lunch and learns require almost no budget. Like literally almost, if you have a conference room in your facility that holds 20 people and you already have a target account list and you already have an email marketing platform and a CRM platform, do you know what it costs to host 20 people in that conference room once a month for the next 12 months? Most of your work is just sending out invites and having your SDRs and AEs get the right people to register and attend. Your out-of-pocket expenses, when you're talking about bringing in some breakfast or bringing in some lunch for 15 or 20 people, peanuts, absolutely nothing, almost nothing relative to what you're spending to fly your team across the country or fly your team across the globe to be able to attend these events where 80 or 90% of the people attending aren't even your ideal client profile. And if you're running these as a webinar program, again, if you're doing this at scale, at some point you will likely come to the conclusion that your team actually needs a full-time webinar manager that can run several fantastic events like this. They're like a producer. They work with the subject matter experts internally to build the decks, set up the landing pages, run the ads, run all the emails and everything like that. And gosh, if you're selling to enterprises or mid-market clients where you're talking about 6-figure deals, 7-figure deals, how many new clients do you need from that channel to pay for that entire initiative? What, 1 new client, 2 new clients the entire year? Once you're beyond that, it's like, so I don't understand why people are so married to the past that they don't get how much buyer preferences have changed. This sales and marketing overload question is exactly what your buyers have been expressing for 5 or 10 years. They want a self-driven buyer's journey. And if you don't give it to them, they're going to go to YouTube, they're going to go to LinkedIn, they're going to go to podcasts, they're going to go to all of their generative AI tools and get it. So in order for you to earn your way back in, you need to understand your prospects and clients better than those platforms do, and to be able to operate at a greater level of value. And in order to do that, by very definition, that puts you in the professional development and learning and development business. So your account executive really needs to be seen a lot more like a professor, not an academic ivory tower professor, but someone that is an expert in how this particular buyer persona navigates all of the forks in the road that come up when it comes to picking the right telecommunications infrastructure and connectivity platform, making the right decisions by introducing prospects and clients to how others in similar job functions in the same geographic region and similar sized companies, similar industries have navigated these exact functions. And the better job you do at that, you'll no longer be considered sales and marketing, so you won't have to worry about the sales and marketing overload. But like 10 years ago, when we saw CEB, the corporate executive board, discover 57% of a typical journey was over before sales contact, that's now a very distant memory. They're not in there for the last 43% of the journey with you anymore, if only. Now they're only in there for the last 17% of the journey. They're doing 83% of researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing on their own. That comes directly from Gartner. So the only way that you're going to be in there for more than the last half of the final quarter of the game is to earn your way in there by being seen more as a teacher, a consultant, a trusted advisor, a subject matter expert, and maybe even a thought leader. That's how you get past the overload. That's how you get out of the vendor box. That's how you stay out of the vendor box. And that's how you motivate your most important ideal clients to want to spend a lot of time with your client-facing team members, because you're providing a lot more value than they can get on their own just by watching YouTube videos, attending webinars. Of course, your webinars are a different story. You should be educating and building trust, or just talking to their LLM tools. If they're not getting more value than reading your website, watching your explainer videos, and talking to your LLM tools, you have some work to do. So these are these are the considerations I'd be thinking about for how a telecommunications infrastructure and connectivity provider can address sales and marketing overload. If you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button to help spread the word, and leave us a comment on the value that you're getting on whatever platform you're watching on, or if you're listening to the audio experience, make sure that you rate and review us as well. Okay, what do we have up next? This is an interesting one. So our next question has to do with a part of the data center ecosystem that spans both technology and facilities. There's actually quite a few business models where it's very common to find companies involved in both the IT side and the facility side. So question is, how can an advanced data center analytics and monitoring company improve its lead generation and sales? How can an advanced data center analytics and monitoring company improve its lead generation and sales? So two completely different things, not the analytics and monitoring, but the lead generation and the sales. And by definition, usually lead generation has to come before sales. If you get sales that's happening without lead generation, you don't have any context and you have no idea if they're even the right fit to have purchased your analytics and monitoring in the first place. So let's unwrap this starting at the beginning. So your company is primarily in the business. It's basically in the software business, probably either traditional software as a service for analytics and monitoring to help data center related clients. These could be data center operators like colocation or hyperscalers. They could be enterprises that have their own data centers, or it could be both. So you're providing some kind of advanced analytics and monitoring solution, and you're struggling with lead generation and sales. In order for us to get better at improving lead generation, improving sales, a lot of it comes down to understanding that most of your buyers don't want to spend much time with your sales team anymore. They want to learn as much as possible without having to be put through a qualification process, without having to get put through the ringer. And this isn't especially new in the software industry, in the SaaS, software as a service kind of industry, because 10 years ago, this movement started called PLG, product-led growth. And product-led growth was like the next generation of freemium, where basically you're creating a fully functional free version of the product that's so good that people just want to use it. And it's so valuable that they start to invite their coworkers to use it. And as you start to add seats and add more features, they go from being a free user to upgrading to paid seats. So PLG, product-led growth, has been around a long time. The bizarre part is there's people within the data center ecosystem that work at software companies that believe that because they're selling data center software, the exact same IT professionals that buy SaaS from dozens of other companies using a self-driven journey, like something similar to product-led growth, we're like, oh no, you guys are in the data center industry. Because of that, you're special. And because you're so special, I'll put up with crap that I haven't put up with in 10 years ago. And I'll buy the way I used to buy in the 1990s. Got a CD-ROM for me? Like, don't be that company. That's, at the end of the day, it's very important to understand your buyers and understand your buyers much better than competitors understand your buyers. Because without that, you come across as like tone deaf. And the better job we can do at understanding exactly who they are and what's going on in their world, the better job we can do with arriving early and often. And that's the key to unlocking successful lead generation and sales cycle acceleration in today's data center, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities, is we need to understand that by default, they don't want to spend much time with you anymore until they're just about ready to buy. If they could spend zero time with you and buy on their own, they probably would. But more than likely, your category, being that you're selling advanced analytics and monitoring, is complex enough that you're not quite ready for it to be self-sign up or to abdicate the whole thing to channel partners or something like that. So with that in mind, what can we do to earn our way back in early and often? Well, it's about getting super clear about your ideal client profile, super clear about who the most important buyer personas are, and how we can help each of those buyer personas with some of their biggest goals and challenges. So let's say, for argument's sake, your analytics and monitoring company sets up his ideal client profile and you're selling globally. You can sell to large, small businesses and mid-market companies successfully. So you're looking for companies that have, I don't know, anywhere from 50 to 1,000 employees, 50 to 1,000 employees. And this crosses industries. So it's a real simple, straightforward, ideal client profile. But who are the right people in these companies to reach? And that's the challenge with all of this, is that when you're selling to smaller companies, you don't tend to have a lot of specialization. You're selling to a lot of generalists. Whereas when you're selling to enterprises, you have a lot more specialization, and you potentially have 4, 5, 6 different kinds of people that may need to weigh in on whether you can move forward with new initiative around analytics and monitoring. So I'd almost argue that those two extremes almost need a different playbook and a different approach. But if you're going to place them together, just be aware that this is something, again, talk to your product manager and figure out for sure talk to your sales director and figure out for sure. But when you look at your 10 most recent deals or your 10 biggest deals that have closed in the last 6 months to a year, of the kinds of clients that you want a lot more of, who are the key people from those accounts that were involved? What were their job titles? What was their role within the organization? How much budgetary control do they have? Where were they located relative to the company headquarters? Roll all of that together. And the one who has the biggest economic impact on whether that company moved forward or not, that's you're going to call your primary buyer persona. The kind of stakeholder that has the second most financial impact, economic impact on whether they move forward or not, that's your secondary buyer persona. And at least for the first and second most important, we need to study the heck out of those folks. Like anthropologist kind of sociologist kind of study. But what we essentially need to know is for each of those two kinds of people, what they're working on, what their biggest goals, what their biggest initiatives are right now, things that like show up in their job description, things that show up on their LinkedIn summary, things that show up in their objectives and key results, their OKRs for this particular quarter. What are they working on individually? What is their team working on? What's their company working on that directly or indirectly relates to advanced analytics and monitoring? And when we get the consensus on like those top 5 or 6 big goals, the next thing we want to look at is the 5 or 6 biggest things that are driving them nuts. What are their biggest challenges? What are their stressors? What's messing with their work-life balance? What's screwing with their psychological safety? What's ruining their time, their ability to unplug and go on vacation once in a while? What infuriates their family members when they're on vacation and they're getting dragged back because their analytics and monitoring solution kind of isn't very good right now? So once you understand those 5 or 6 big goals and those 5 or 6 biggest challenges, you'll end up with 10 or 12 topics that are top of mind for that particular buyer persona, for the primary buyer persona, the most important economic stakeholder. Then do the exact same thing. Do interviews in person or by Zoom or by phone, run surveys, study their search and social footprint, study their CRM records, and figure out for the secondary and maybe even for the tertiary buyer persona, what's their top 5 or 6 biggest goals, their top 5 or 6 biggest challenges. So we get a list of 10 or 12 topics that are very, very top of mind for that particular person right now. Once we understand that, we can go about creating fantastically relevant lead generation offers that educate and build trust. A good way to think of this is if you're doing like a lead magnet, like a special report or an ebook or downloadable planning guide or something like that, those 10 or 12 topics or those 5 or 6 biggest goals or 5 or 6 biggest challenges could literally be your table of contents for a 10, 20, 30 page ebook. Or you could do half and half. You could do the goals and the challenges. You could do the priorities versus the mistakes or the frustrations or something like that. You obviously work on your titles and work on your positioning, but that gives you an idea of what you might want to address in an overview kind of guide. Along the same lines, you could run a webinar or an offline webinar, like a breakfast seminar or lunch and learn, and you use those 5 or 6 topics as your outline. However, what I'd encourage you to do is, because multi-touch, being in a long-term relationship with your prospects and clients, so you're in a position to really dramatically impact the criteria that they use to evaluate all the different options that are in front of them when it comes to analytics and monitoring. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So with those 10 or 12 topics, rather than trying to knock out 5 or 6 of those in 1 or 2 events or webinars, take each of those separately. And that's your events calendar for the next 10 or 12 months, once or twice a month. If you have prospects and clients that are located nearby to where you're located, and they can drive to your main office to attend an event once a month because they're 30, 60 minutes away, you could run these as in-person events. If most of your target account list of most of your ideal client profile is long distance, you run them as webinars. If they're global, crossing more than 2 or 3 time zones, you may need to do more than one webinar series, because people that are attending in the Americas in their day may be sleeping when you find the perfect time to run these webinars in Asia Pacific. So like those are all the things that come into play. And of course, record these. There's always going to be best case scenario on a marketing webinar. You'll get 30, 40, 50% of the people attending. There's always a ton of people who wish they could attend that weren't able to be there. So for sure, make the recording available. And then of course, there's always, when you do a good job, there's always going to be people after the event. They're like, oh, you know what? The rest of my team really should have been here. My boss really should have been here. Do you have the slides? Do you have the recording that I can forward to him or her to watch on their own? So, and of course, those recordings open up a lot of possibilities for great repurposing, for long form video, short form video, carousels, PDFs, social media posts, email newsletters, blogs, premium content, the whole 9 yards. But that's how you can improve lead generation right off the bat, is get really dialed into who they are and what they care about, and make your premium content, your lead magnets, all about that. Make your event strategy all about that. And again, don't delude yourself into thinking that any of this is one and done. It takes most of the time when you're looking at these kinds of buyers for this kind of considered purchase decision, there may be 25 to 30 touch points, like 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision. If you're only having a relationship with your prospects and clients on one or two of those, you're leaving your company really vulnerable to competitors that get it a lot more, that understand a lot more about how much the world has changed. And they're in there for 10, 15, 20 of those 28 touch points. So if you want to compete more effectively, to have more skin in the game, more surface area throughout that full journey, so you have a chance to meet multiple stakeholders and influence multiple stakeholders from that company, early and often is incredibly important. Intercepting them as early as possible in the buyer's journey and as often as possible in the buyer's journey, throughout the awareness, the consideration, not just the decision stage, not just the end of the journey, but throughout the early and the middle stages as well. Again, think about the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context. So they see your client-facing team members as some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to anything and everything directly related to advanced data center analytics and monitoring. When you do this well, you'll start to notice that several people from the same company are coming and learning from your client-facing team members. When you do that, you're not only nearly guaranteeing to be on the short list and stay on the short list, but you start to proactively knock competitive alternatives off of the short list. You don't even have to mention them. They're spending so much time from you. You're doing so much education and trust building that no one can hold a candle to the relationship that you have with those key folks on the decision committee and that kind of company. And it becomes a very, very natural thing that when they're ready, when they're finally at that last 5, 10, 15% and they're ready for the sales conversation, you may literally be the only one they're reaching out to. In other words, there's no short list, or the short list essentially is one company now. It's your company. You won the battle by doing a phenomenal job with inserting yourself into their professional development, their learning and development process, teaching them everything and anything they need to know for this particular kind of job function in a company in this particular region of roughly the size in this kind of industry, what they need to be thinking about when it comes to their advanced analytics and monitoring goals and challenges. So that's what I'd be thinking about for improving lead generation, how I'd be thinking about improving sales. The unlock with sales is getting out of that vendor box and staying out of that vendor box. And the better job you can do with repositioning your account executives and your account managers to look a lot more like teachers and consultants and trusted advisors and subject matter experts, the more your prospects and clients are going to want to spend time with those client-facing members of your team. If they're still acting like pushy AEs and pushy AMs from 10, 15 years ago, and they haven't adjusted to this new reality of the self-driven journey, it's going to be a really, really uphill battle. But if you truly understand who they are at the account level, who they are at the individual level, and what's going on in their world, and you're obsessed about providing an enormous amount of value for them throughout their full journey, using internal and perhaps even external subject matter experts to have these fantastic educational events experiences. Again, you do not need large numbers. You can have 10, 20, 30 people in the room and really make a fantastic impact. Don't get sucked into this vanity metrics nonsense that you need to be at a conference where there's hundreds or thousands of people when 80 or 90% of them are not ICP match for you. You just need the right people and more time, more at bats, more session time with the right people from the right accounts. And even if the first couple of events you're getting relatively junior people in that account, word will start to spread as they're learning more, and they're bringing in their manager, and their manager's bringing their manager, and they're bringing people from other teams. This is a really, really powerful growth engine when you recognize that the most effective way for you to get back in and improve your lead generation and improve your sales cycle acceleration, improve your sales velocity, is to lean into how they want to navigate their journey. And they don't want to spend time with sales anymore, but they do need to spend time learning. And to the extent that your go-to-market team members can be part of that learning process, either because they individually have enough subject matter expertise to share, or at the absolute minimum, they're just really good tour guides, really good concierges, really good curators, really good moderators, it's still a big, big win-win for you and your team. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how an advanced data center analytics and monitoring company can improve its lead generation and sales. You're watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we will add that to the consideration queue. And that brings us to our final question for this week. Okay, what do we got? So our final question for this week brings us back into the data center operator part of the data center industry, and in particular, wholesale data center providers. It's an area that people don't really talk about that much if they're placing all their attention on co-location, on hyperscale and edge. But wholesale data center providers are a big, big force in data center development and data center real estate. This tends to be companies that are looking for one huge tenant to take their entire facility, or perhaps even take their entire campus. Sometimes it's called an anchor tenant, but typically they are building the shell and they get somebody else that comes in and finishes the rest of the data center facility, built to suit, built to their specific needs, as opposed to trying to guess who the ideal tenant was. So for a wholesale data center provider, again, that like straddles the line between a data center operator and a data center real estate, a data center developer kind of company, or even an investor if they're the ones providing the capital. How does a wholesale data center provider reach high-level decision makers? How does a wholesale data center provider reach high-level decision makers? That is a terrific question, and it's one that I get asked quite often from wholesale data center providers, from data center developers, from folks in data center construction and real estate who get involved in these kinds of conversations. And a lot of it comes down to looking at what you can offer and having a fair amount of self-awareness on where you can win. Sometimes you're winning because you're operating in a region where there's special tax incentives and rebates to be able to pull in a certain kind of tenant, perhaps a certain kind of data center operator. Sometimes you think you can win because you have data grid availability in a region where nobody has data power availability. Sometimes you think you can win because you have alternate energy in an area that's very grid constrained. Like, in other words, you have deep expertise, you have a partnership with someone that's providing turbines for liquid natural gas, or doing something with hydrogen fuel cells, or maybe you're doing something really special and you're working with someone that's doing small modular reactors to provide nuclear energy to that particular data center. But typically, reaching the high-level decision makers is trying to assess where you have a strong competitive advantage, and using that to shape your ideal client profile and shape your target account list and figure out who the key people are in those accounts that you need to create awareness with. The challenge that I see a lot of times with wholesale data center providers is they're focusing on selling like it's a piece of real estate. And to a certain degree, it is a real estate centric play. But the reality is, if you just wanted to approach getting your anchor tenant, if you just wanted to approach leasing out the whole facility, you more than likely would be going directly to someone that's a data center real estate broker, as opposed to trying to figure out your own plan for reaching high-level decision makers. I've seen companies where they're doing both simultaneously, and there's pros and cons with that. But at the end of the day, this is a huge, huge sale that you're trying to influence. It's very, very rare that a wholesale data center provider space is being leased for anything less than 6 figures. Often it's 7 figures. Sometimes it's even considerably more than that. So for sure, you have strong unit economics. That said, it's like the opposite of selling enterprise colocation. With enterprise colocation, you will figure out over time who your ideal clients are. You'll be able to build a playbook for a repeatable sales process. You'll be able to onboard multiple account executives and sales development reps and account managers that can scale that sales process to get a couple dozen or a couple hundred tenants. For a wholesale data center provider, they're not really looking for a couple dozen tenants or 100 tenants. They may be looking literally for one tenant. and they're just trying to reach multiple people from that company who would weigh in on the decision committee. That's the other thing too that's worth mentioning is quite often I get people coming to me that express that one of their biggest bottlenecks, one of their biggest roadblocks is trouble reaching the decision maker. The reality is, even in this context where you have wholesale data center space and you're trying to get your master tenant, your anchor tenant, you're leasing the majority, all or the majority of their space, it's relatively rare that the decision maker, even if you get to that magic person, is going to make a decision without their team being involved. So what that means is there's no single decision maker anymore, even though there's someone that may ultimately be signing off on the agreement and being involved as the financial decision maker. The reality is it's always multiple stakeholders that are involved across a full committee. At the absolute minimum, when it comes to something like this, you have a data center development expert, you have a construction expert, because there's certainly a fair amount of construction that's been going on internally. You have a facilities expert, you have an IT expert, you have a real estate person, you have perhaps a compliance person, for sure a legal person, a finance person. There's a lot of different stakeholders that are involved. So at some point, to be successful, you will need to figure out for your size deal and the competitive advantages that you bring to the table, who are the 2 or 3 most important kinds of stakeholders. In a perfect world, you would have content on your website and you'd have slides in your deck and you'd have the ability to successfully influence all of those stakeholders. What did I just list? 6, 7, 8 different stakeholders. But for a relatively small wholesale data center provider that doesn't have a large marketing and sales operations organization, it may not be practical to simultaneously be marketing, building pipeline, and lead generation and lead acceleration with 6, 7, 8 different kinds of stakeholders. So you'll pick the top 1 or 2 or 3 that you think are most important. And yeah, the decision maker, or who we perceive to be the decision maker, should certainly be within that list of people that we want to reach, but recognize that it's also just as valid to get to someone that's on that person's team or that directly reports to them or lateral reports to them, because especially in relatively small companies, or especially at the highest levels of seniority, everyone knows everyone. And it's not like you're being blocked because they don't know who to go to if they're serious about finding wholesale data center space in your particular market. The reality is what we really need to do is we need to use your thought leadership content. We need to use your thought leadership events to influence several different stakeholders on that decision committee in that particular company, who are either at the innermost ring, who are going to be the ultimate financial decision maker, or who sit side by side with that person in the decision-making hierarchy. And in the course of doing this, many times you'll also get to people that are 1 or 2 reports below some of those stakeholders. And that's fine as well. It's just that we want to be as intentional, as deliberate about what we're doing with creating our website copywriting, with creating our outbound emails, with creating our lead generation offers, with creating our event strategy, to really dial into who they are and what they care about. Again, I see a lot of people that come from a real estate perspective that want to just completely bypass the early and the middle part of the journey and go direct to trying to get a meeting to someone that's looking for real estate. And if you really think that your company doesn't have much to talk about besides its real estate or its development prospects, it's possible that that's the right approach for you. If you're selling a really considered purchase, if you're a relatively new brand in this place, if you don't have a lot of visibility, it's pretty important to lead with that thought leadership content to establish credibility, to establish some social proof. So again, I can't perfectly contextualize this without knowing your context of how big or small your company is, how strong or weak your brand is, the competitive advantages of this particular facility relative to other competitors in the market for this particular wholesale data center. But those are at the high level of what I'd be thinking about, because like the first fork in the road is, are you even building your own marketing and sales engine, or are you just punting this? Are you just delegating? Are you just abdicating this whole thing to a data center real estate firm? And that's a very valid choice. But if you want to be able to do both, or if you want to lean in more heavily into doing a lot more of this on your own, then for sure, recognize that your stakeholders that you're trying to educate and build trust with, that you're trying to influence, are very similar to the other kinds of stakeholders that research and make purchase decisions throughout the data center ecosystem, meaning that they don't want to spend a lot of time with salespeople anymore. Sure, they need to learn. Sure, they spend a lot of time on learning and development and professional development, keeping up with what's going on in the industry. But if you just show up and you're trying to pitch and beg for a meeting and use deceptive, manipulative tactics to try to get that meeting and everything, it doesn't play well. They need to see you as an expert. And if you're trying to get a foot in the door with the finance person, they need to see you as an expert on the financial side, on the accounting side of wholesale data center development. If you're trying to get a foot in the door with a real estate person, along the same lines, they want to talk to peers. So to the extent that you or someone from your team will be seen as a peer of a counterpart on this target account, that's really what you should be leading with. Does that mean that you need to borrow your CFO or borrow your head of real estate or borrow your head of engineering for being involved as a part-time part of the sales process? No, but after you've done your homework on what that particular stakeholder cares the most about, I would try to see if you can get a half hour to an hour to interview your internal stakeholder to be able to create some premium content and blogs and videos out of that. I would use that for sure to influence some of the slides and talking points when you get to those initial meetings. And I would reserve for that person to come into really late stage, high leverage opportunities where you can score huge points to that person being able to establish and build rapport way faster than you'll be able to as a generalist or someone that brings another kind of expertise to the table. Again, in a hyper competitive marketplace, we're increasingly seeing people stack their sales teams with subject matter experts that bring deeply niched industry specific expertise. So if you want to be able to compete effectively against that, if you don't have that expertise, look to someone else on your team that can help to fill that gap on a very fractional, very part-time kind of basis without it becoming burdensome relative to their day job, to their primary job responsibilities. So that's what I'd be thinking about when it comes to reaching wholesale data center provider decision makers who more than likely you're looking for a master tenant, anchor tenant to be able to take an entire facility or potentially take an entire campus. So that's the final question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've gotten good value from this week's show, be sure to hit the like button to help spread this. And if you're listening to this on one of the audio platforms, be sure to rate and review this as well. If you have an idea for a topic or a question that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments as well. And we'll add that to the consideration queue for topics that we can address in an upcoming episode of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. If you want to make sure that you keep up with opportunities to attend educational events and get access to educational resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter, which you can brings email notifications to your inbox on Sundays. You can sign up for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg, founder of DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you'd like to be sure to mention in the connect invitation that you like to watch and that you're a fan of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. So I'm so glad that you're able to join us for this week's show, and we wish you great success in growing your influence, your team's influence, and your company's influence throughout data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. Look forward to seeing you back next week. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.